Police Department.
I don't want kids. You have 3 kids. What's wrong with you?
On May 5th, 1993, 3 8-year-old boys, Michael Moore, Christopher Byers, and Stevie Branch, disappeared while riding their bikes in West Memphis, Arkansas. Their bodies were found the next day.
The 3 boys were found submerged in water, and it is not an accident. They did not slip off in it. We do have 3 homicide victims.
But a misleading tip about local teenagers led the investigation down a confusing path with no real leads. What really happened to these boys, and how did misdirection in the case alter the course of justice forever? Whether the victims would receive justice or if the case would remain unsolved. On the evening of May 5th, 1993, at 8 p.m., John Mark Byers called the West Memphis police to report that his son, Christopher, was missing. He and his wife, Melissa, told the officer that Chris had last been seen around 5:30 p.m. when he was working in the yard. Within the next 90 minutes, 2 other parents called in with similar concerns. Pamela Hobbs reported that she hadn't seen her son, Stevie Branch, since he left for school that day. Dana Moore said her son, Michael, had gone with friends around 6, but hadn't come home for dinner. These reports of 3 missing boys led to a search in Robin Hood Hills, a place where local kids often played. Despite a careful search that night, no trace of the boys was found. The next morning, on May 6, 1993, Chief Inspector Gary Gitchell took charge of the search. In the early afternoon, Officer Steve Jones saw a black tennis shoe floating in a ditch near the Blue Beacon car wash. Just 15 minutes later, Sergeant Mike Allen discovered the bodies of 3 young boys, Chris Byers, Michael Moore, and Stevie Branch, who were murdered in Robin Hood Hills.
Damien lived 8 miles away from where the bodies were buried. Never drove. None of these kids drove. They didn't have cars.
The 3 boys were found naked and their hands and feet tied up with their own shoelaces in a drainage ditch. Their clothes were found nearby, tangled in tree sticks and mud. Christopher Byers had severe injuries to his genitals, including mutilation. The official cause of death for Byers was multiple injuries, while Moore and Branch died from multiple injuries and drowning. Police initially suspected rape, but later expert testimony disputed this because there was no clear evidence. Small amounts of sperm DNA were found on a pair of pants recovered from the scene. The prosecution argued that Byers' injuries were the result of a deliberate knife attack and castration. This means that defense experts argued that the injuries on the body were probably caused by animals after death, rather than by a human attack. Byers was the only victim found with drugs in his body. In January 1993, he was prescribed Ritalin, a medication for ADHD. However, the first autopsy report incorrectly named the drug as carbamazepine and recorded a dosage that was lower than what was actually prescribed. On May 5, 1993, despite the horrific nature of the crime, there was surprisingly little evidence at the scene. Police were confused by the lack of blood and fibers and noted that the area seemed to have been cleaned. They found themselves dealing with a high-profile case that garnered national attention, but provided very few leads to identify the responsible person or people. As Gitchell approached the crowd gathered at the edge of the woods to deliver the tragic news, Terry Hobbs, Stevie Branch's stepfather, collapsed in grief. The brutal nature of the crime shocked the town, which led to an urgent investigation.
The police had developed a theory that there may have been an occult aspect to the crime.
The idea of a satanic connection in this case arose from several reasons. The brutal details of the crime shocked the community, like the way the bodies were positioned and the castration. Additionally, the secluded location of the crime added to the fear. In the early 1990s, there was a widespread fear of satanic rituals in the U.S., often operated by media reports. Many communities, especially those with strong religious beliefs, were particularly sensitive to these fears. While there wasn't any solid evidence of satanic activity in West Memphis at that time, the combination of local beliefs, The gruesome nature of the crime and media coverage led people to think it could be linked to a cult. This suspicion often overshadowed more logical explanations, such as the idea that someone the boys knew might have harmed them. Fuel to the fire was a statement from the Chief Inspector Gary Gitchell, who told the public that the police were exploring several explanations, which included cult activity. This initial investigation triggered controversy, which led to wrongful convictions and raised serious questions about the reliability of the evidence and the motives of those involved. Investigators quickly started, and 3 young men became suspects, their lives forever changed by a search for answers. They were Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley Jr. Damien Echols was a local teenager with a troubled background. At just 17, he was a high school dropout known for his dark interests and struggles with mental health, which included major depression. His distinctive appearance, like long hair, black clothing, and tattoos, made him a prime suspect in the case. Jerry Driver, another juvenile probation officer in Crittenden County, also believed there was a satanic cult in the area, partly due to his interactions with Echols. Echols had shown unpredictable behavior in the past, like threatening his ex-girlfriend, her new boyfriend, and even his own father. Echols had a history of mental health issues, which included a stay in a psychiatric hospital in Oregon, where he was placed on suicide watch. After returning to Arkansas, he faced more challenges in juvenile detention, which eventually led to hospitalization in Little Rock. Even after his release, he continued therapy and made alarming statements about wanting to follow notorious criminals like Charles Manson. These comments deeply concerned Jerry Driver, who became convinced that Echols was involved in the murders. Jason Baldwin was another suspect, and he was Echols' close friend, and both were seen as social outcasts. Although Baldwin excelled in school and didn't share Echols' interest in magic, they bonded over their shared experiences of feeling like outsiders. Baldwin had previously been arrested for vandalism, while Echols had faced charges for shoplifting. In contrast, Baldwin showed talent in drawing, and one of his teachers encouraged him to pursue graphic design in college. The third suspect, Jessie Misskelley Jr., had little to no connection to either Echols or Baldwin. He was known for his temper and had a reputation for getting into fistfights with other teens at school. Misskelley, like Echols, had dropped out of high school while Baldwin continued to excel academically. From May 7th to May 10th, police interrogated Damien Echols multiple times, both at his home and at the police station. Throughout these sessions, he consistently claimed he had no knowledge of the boys and referred to the murderer as sick.
Throughout this interview, and they're going to be judging you.
Right.
How do you think they're going to judge you?
I don't know.
You're either innocent and a terrible victim of a justice system gone wrong, or you're a terrible cold-blooded killer of children.
I think you'll probably have people who think both.
Echols insisted he was at home on the night of May 5th and was talking on the phone with friends. However, when he suggested that the killer was likely someone local, it raised suspicions about his own involvement. Despite cooperating with the police, Echols' polygraph results indicated possible deception or lying, which increased more speculation. Investigators also turned their attention to Jason Baldwin, who denied any wrongdoing, but detectives continued to scrutinize both teens. The case took a turn when Vicki Hutchison, a local waitress, expressed her belief that the murders were linked to a cult. She was eager to assist the police and suggested to law enforcement that she could investigate further by befriending Echols. Misskelley became involved with Echols through his babysitting job for Vicki Hutchison. Hutchison began asking Misskelley questions about the case and eventually introduced him to Echols. Hutchison claimed to have attended an occult gathering, or esbat, where she witnessed strange rituals and sexual activities involving young people, and Misskelley joined them. This led to Misskelley being brought in for questioning at the police station. The situation grew more complicated when Hutchison's son, Aaron, mentioned that he had visited the woods with the murdered boys and claimed to have seen 5 men engaging in unusual activities.
He did a cult satanic meeting.
Okay. What did he tell you?
He told me how he dismembered the kid, he sucked the blood from the scrotum, and put the balls in his mouth.
This complicated an already shaky story. Even with inconsistencies, when police took her polygraph test, it indicated she was telling the truth. On June 3, 1993, Chief Inspector Gary Gitchell and his team decided to question Jessie Misskelley, a suspect in the murders of 3 young boys from West Memphis. They approached him around 9 a.m. and emphasized the $35,000 reward for information that could lead to arrests. During the polygraph interview, Jessie denied any involvement in the murders. However, Detective Bill Durham suspected he was lying. Under intense questioning, Jessie eventually claimed he, along with Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin, had committed the murders. Jessie later described how the officers shouted at him and insisted he knew more than he was admitting. He struggled to maintain his innocence and began repeating information given to him by the detectives. When he incorrectly stated that the boys were tied with rope, Gitchell corrected him and said they were tied with shoelaces. This caused Jessie to change his story to match the officer's details he was mentioning. After hours of interrogation, confession of Jessie was recorded. He claimed to have witnessed the events in Robin Hood Woods and said Damien hit Chris Byers and Jason assaulted Steve Branch.
Christopher. That's who you're pointing at?
Mm-hmm. If you'll read the caption, the grisly slaying from left, 8-year-old Michael Moore, Stephen Branch, and Christopher Byers. Okay. So, you saw Damien strike Chris Byers in the head. Right. What did he hit him with?
He hit him with his fist and bruised him all up real bad. And then Jason turned around and hit Steve Branch and started doing the same thing. Then the other one took off. Michael Moore took off running. So I chased him and grabbed him and held him till they got there, and then I left.
Shortly after, Deputy Prosecutor John Fogelman sought warrants to search the homes of Jessie, Jason, and Damien. By 10:30 p.m., all 3 were arrested and charged with capital murder. The next morning, Gitchell held a press conference and expressed strong confidence in the case. When they were arrested, Jessie Misskelley Jr. was 17, Jason Baldwin was 16, and Damien Echols was 18 years old. On August 4, 1993, Judge David Burnett held a pretrial hearing in Marion, Arkansas. He decided that Jessie Misskelley would be tried separately from Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin. The judge also allowed Jessie's confession to be used as evidence, despite the defense claiming it was obtained under pressure. The defense pointed out various forcible tactics used by police during Jessie's interrogation. They noted how officers dismissed his statements and presented a diagram suggesting he could either be part of the circle of killers or cooperate with them. They also highlighted a troubling audio tape where Aaron claimed, "Nobody knows what happened but me." In a significant ruling, the judge decided that all 3 defendants would be tried as adults. This decision heightened the stakes in a case that is already attracting national attention and generating discussions about how juvenile suspects are treated in the justice system. Misskelley said he was confused by the behavior of the police and tried to cooperate without understanding the consequences of his statements. Meanwhile, the 3 boys remained in custody as both the prosecution and defense prepared for trial. During the evidence gathering, blood was found on a knife previously owned by John Mark Byers, who was Chris Byers' stepfather. This knife had been given away shortly after the murders, and the blood matched both Chris and Mark's blood. However, the police did not follow up on this lead. Additionally, a local restaurant employee reported seeing a disoriented man covered in mud and blood the night the boys went missing. The man left blood smears in the restroom, and although the police collected samples, they never followed this lead and later lost the evidence. The prosecutor intended for Misskelley to testify against them, but Misskelley refused to repeat his earlier statements and withdrew his confession. Misskelley's trial started on January 26, 1994, and Baldwin and Echols were tried a month later, beginning on February 28th. Both trials attracted a lot of media attention and faced legal challenges as Judge Burnett, Prosecutor Fogelman, and the defense teams decided what evidence could be shown to the jury. On January 18, 1994, Jessie Misskelley's trial began in Corning, Arkansas, with a jury of 7 women and 5 men. Prosecutor John Fogelman admitted there were inconsistencies in Jessie's confession, but claimed they were because Jessie was trying to downplay his role in the murders of 3 boys. He argued that Jessie was involved with Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin. Defense attorney Dan Stidham countered that Jessie was unfairly targeted due to pressure to make arrests. He criticized what he called the Damien Echols tunnel vision and said it distorted the investigation. Stidham insisted that Jessie's confession was forced and that he was scared during questioning. The trial became emotional when the mothers of the 3 murdered boys testified. They shared their last moments with their sons on May 5, 1993.
I would like to see another trial, give them a fair trial, present the evidence that really wasn't presented in the other trials, and if they're guilty, so be it, that's where they stay. But if they're not, God, don't put somebody to death because, oops.
He chose not to follow that line of questioning because he was worried it might upset judges who sympathized with the grieving families. The prosecution presented a disturbing account of the case. Detective described the search for the missing boys, which led to the painful discovery of their bodies. The judges saw the boys' bicycles leaning against a wall in the courtroom. Fogelman showed over 30 graphic photos of the bodies, which created a sad atmosphere in the courtroom. Pathologists talked about the autopsy results, while more disturbing images were shown. Inspector Gary Gitchell mentioned that Jessie seemed very relaxed during the long questioning. To strengthen his case, Fogelman played a recording of Jessie's 34-minute confession, which left the jury silent. During cross-examination, major inconsistencies appeared in Jessie's statements. He had claimed the murders happened around noon and that the boys were bound with brown rope, which didn't fit the evidence. Detective Gitchell said these errors were just Jessie being confused. The prosecution chose not to call key eyewitness Aaron Hutchison because he was worried his story might fall apart. Instead, they called his mother, Vicky, who spoke about her search for justice. She insisted the $35,000 reward didn't influence her, but her motivation was concern for the boys. During cross-examination, some big inconsistencies popped up in Jessie's statements, especially regarding when the murders happened. The prosecution chose not to call key eyewitness Aaron Hutchison to testify. Instead, they brought in his mother, who talked about her efforts to seek justice for the boys.
They wasn't there at the day they were missing, and I went to Robin Hood.
Okay, did your mama pick you up at school?
As for physical evidence, there weren't signs to prove Jessie to the crime. Crime lab expert testified about some fibers found near the bodies. However, she later clarified that those fibers could have come from various sources, not just Jessie. Stidham decided against having Jessie testify because of concerns about his low IQ. Instead, he tried to create reasonable doubt by calling a polygraph examiner to talk about false confessions. Judge ruled that polygraph results couldn't be used, but he allowed Holmes to explain the pressures that can lead someone to falsely confess. Dr. Richard Offshee, who was a social psychologist, testified for the defense about how police pressure influenced Jessie's confession. Despite prosecution objections, he was allowed to explain that Jessie made a false statement due to the pressure he faced, especially as someone with low self-esteem. During cross-examination, the prosecutor pointed out that the police hadn't physically harmed Jessie. This allowed Stidham to emphasize how the nature of the questioning influenced Jessie's confession, and the psychological pressure was a key factor in what happened. In his closing argument, Fogelman told the jury to ignore claims of pressure, trust the detectives, and called the defense's arguments distractions. Stidham warned that executing an innocent person would be a serious mistake, but the prosecutor stressed that Jessie's confession was clear. The next day, Jessie entered the courtroom with his head down. When the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, he felt crushed. He received a life sentence without parole, and when the judge asked him if he had anything to say, simply said, "No." The trial raised serious questions about the justice system, with many believing it punished an innocent person. The focus on forced confessions led to demands for better interrogation methods and new evidence that encouraged a review of Jessie's sentence. 2 weeks after Jessie Misskelley was sentenced, the trial for Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin began in Jonesboro, Arkansas. Defense attorney Dan Stidham announced that Jessie would not testify, which left the prosecution with weak evidence. The judge didn't allow the two defendants to have separate trials, and the prosecutors could argue that Echols' apparent interest in witchcraft was related to involvement in the case of Baldwin. Essentially, they could use Echols' background to suggest Baldwin was also guilty. Prosecutor John Fogelman claimed they would prove the defendants were responsible for the murders of 3 boys. Baldwin's lawyer emphasized the good character of his client, and Echols' attorney argued there was no evidence of guilt. The prosecution called the parents of the victims and detectives to discuss the last moments of the boys. Detective mentioned Jessie's confession, which led to a defense request for a mistrial that the judge denied. Ridge also claimed Damien spoke about demonic forces to suggest he was involved in supernatural practices. They presented items from Damien's home, like occult books and a dog skull, to support their case. Medical expert Dr. Frank Peretti testified about a knife found near Damien's house, which was matching victim wounds, but it was later revealed that a knife belonging to the victim's stepfather could also match. The defense highlighted the lack of solid evidence linking Echols and Baldwin to the crime and aimed to show inconsistencies in the arguments of the prosecution. They called witnesses and experts to discuss false confessions and emphasized that the evidence was merely suggestive.
Inspector Gitchell, Jessie says that the murders took place around noon. How did you know that was incorrect?
Because the young boys were still in school.
Did at any time when he was telling you these things that you knew were incorrect, did it ever occur to you that what he was telling you was false, his entire story was false?
Jessie simply got confused.
Despite attempts to establish an alibi and question the reliability of the police investigation, the jury found both defendants guilty of capital murder. After the jury found Jason Baldwin guilty, he was given a life sentence in prison without the chance for parole. Damien Echols, on the other hand, received the death penalty, specifically lethal injection. This outcome attracted a lot of public interest and led to doubts about whether the trial was fair and just. After their trials, defense teams of the West Memphis Three worked tirelessly to appeal their sentences and found trial errors in presenting new evidence. Vicki Hutchison admitted she had lied under police pressure, and the jury foreman was accused of improper behavior during the trial, which potentially influenced the verdict. New DNA evidence linked Terry Hobbs, who was Chris Byers' stepfather, to the crime scene, which led to a new hearing. The case attracted widespread support. Filmmakers Bruce Sinofsky and Joe Berlinger released the documentary Paradise Lost in 1996, while Arkansas reporter Mara Leverett wrote Devil's Knot, which highlighted the failure of justice. Celebrities like Eddie Vedder, Natalie Maines, and Johnny Depp also voiced their support. On November 4, 2010, after multiple failed appeals, the Arkansas Supreme Court ordered a hearing for the new evidence. Echols' new lawyers recognized that this evidence might not prove their innocence, which led to negotiations with the Attorney General to skip the hearing and move to new trials. They proposed an Alford plea, which allowed the defendants to plead guilty to lesser charges while maintaining their innocence. though it limited their ability to seek compensation for their wrongful convictions. Despite reservations, Jason Baldwin accepted the plea to protect Echols from a death sentence. On August 19, 2011, all three men were released after 18 years in prison. However, their case remained unresolved, with no further investigation into the original murders and no compensation for their time served. In July 2021, Echols' attorneys sought access to crime scene evidence for DNA testing, which was initially lost. Later, it was revealed that most evidence was intact. On April 18, 2024, the Arkansas Supreme Court ruled that those who take an offered plea still have the right to seek a new trial under a specific act and allowed Echols to follow new DNA testing. Their release led to conversations about justice, how reliable eyewitness testimony is, and how societal fears can affect legal decisions. The case reminds us of the problems in the justice system and the ongoing struggle for those wrongfully imprisoned and convicted.